Woo! Okay, perhaps there is no other topic more synonymous with the word America than the idea of freedom. As America was colonized, there was such a spirit of cooperation among people, and because a lot of the folks that came from Europe who already had a faith that very much self-governed the way that they conducted themselves, a lot of the colonists began to wonder why they need government at all. In fact, some of the founders, or some of our founding fathers, were obsessed with the Iroquois nation. I didn't learn a lot about this in school, but believe it or not, the Iroquois nation was a confederacy of different Native American tribes. They interacted together as one unified state. They did not have courts, they didn't have jails, but somehow they learned to live in conjunction with each other. Now, some of the symbols in our American coinage and some of our official documents were actually taken from the Iroquois nation. They were fascinated with the idea of self-rule. It was so foreign to anything that they'd ever experienced. As we all know, and we will celebrate in a couple of weeks, our nation declared their independence from England. They rebelled against the tyranny of their age. After the American Revolution, we were a confederacy. We were under the Articles of Confederation, and a few years later, we adopted or embraced a more energized framework through the U.S. Constitution. After that, about a year later, we ratified the Bill of Rights to ensure that certain liberties would not be infringed upon. But even in the land of the free, we really screwed it up when it came to liberty. Sorry to say, not everybody had the chance to enjoy freedom. At our Constitutional Convention in 1787, there was a heated debate over whether or not to continue to allow involuntary servitude in America. The revolutionaries had allied themselves in their fight against England with the slave trade from England. Why did they do this? Because if they didn't have their support, they were afraid that they might not be able to repel them. And even with the money and the support of the slave trade and their ships and their resources, we still were barely able to repel them. So after this heated debate at the Constitutional Convention, we made perhaps the worst compromise in American history when we allowed slavery to continue in the land of the free. Now, without trying to get historically political, although it may be too late, this compromise of American principles has left a legacy, rightly so, of distrust, of fear, of animosity, and a track record of injustice in this nation. God forgive us. We are still to this day dealing with the wake of this very ugly part of America's history because slavery is bondage. Now, although in this day and time, slavery is illegal, bondage is alive and well all over the world and here in America. A woman sells herself on the streets for next to nothing. She answers to her pimp. He owns her. She is a slave. She is in bondage to the sex industry. A drug addict, every day he buys his dope trying to get his fix, trying to comfort the way that he feels, medicate his pain from lost relationships, lost opportunities, and trying to anesthetize the pain of feeling like his entire future has been erased right in front of his eyes. His drugs become his master, calling his shots, making all of his decisions for him. He is a slave to addiction. Addiction is his master. Addiction is bondage. A woman is so deeply in debt that she can't afford to pay her bills. She can't pay her rent. She can't pay her mortgage. And the father of her children doesn't help at all. She's doing it by herself, trying to make their needs met, trying to get her own needs met. She can't come home from work and rest like the rest of us do and watch TV. She has to go back out and wait tables to try to pay off the debt, to try to get what their kids need for their life. Debt is bondage. A little boy grows up in an environment where the only two ways to deal with a conflict or a disagreement are either a heated debate, a heated argument, or a physical altercation. Now, he feels the fear of being on the short end of that stick, and he never, ever, ever again will let anybody hurt him. He never wants to feel that pain. He never wants to feel that fear again. He decides nobody is ever going to hurt him again, so he plays sports to vent that rage. He builds his body up in preparation for defending himself, to become strong and to become an intimidating presence. He gets a lot of attention and a lot of respect because nobody wants to mess with him. He learns, if you intimidate people, They will back down from you. They will give you what you want. Now, at first, his rage was a choice, but after a while, it stopped being that. Rage and anger, instead of becoming his servant, became his master. People became afraid of him. They kept their distance. They didn't want to connect with him because he only had one of two things to offer them, either shame or fear. Anger and rage has become the default tactic that he uses for settling any conflicts in his life. He's so frustrated with people because they don't do what he thinks that they should. The world is stupid to him. Anybody who has to spend extended time around him, his family, his boss, or wherever he goes, all of them have become unacceptable because nobody's doing what he thinks they ought to be doing. He can't enjoy his life. Anger and rage has become his master. Anger is a terrible master. Anger has become his bondage. A young girl became sensitive to all the jokes that people made about her weight when she was growing up, and she secretly began to loathe herself. She sees the images of celebrity ladies on cable shows and in the tabloids, and she begins to hate her body. She's unbelievably intelligent. Her academic scores are through the roof, but because she came from a genetically large family, she hates herself. She has tried diet after diet, and nothing works. Boys don't notice her. Her teachers just see her as another name on the roster. She is dying inside. She wants so badly to be liked. She heard somewhere about bulimia, but she really doesn't care what happens to her body. Something has got to set her free from this image. The first time she purged, it was awful. But in that process, somehow, she felt proud of herself. She felt like she took the bull by the horn. She felt like she deserved to be punished, and she also felt like she had some control over her weight. She kept purging, and she lost enough weight that boys began to notice her. She wasn't just a fat girl anymore. Now people were saying that she was beautiful. But it didn't matter what they said. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw that girl that she hated. There was not enough compliments in the world to fill that void that was inside of her. And now she can't seem to keep any food down. Bulimia is bondage. A young pimple-faced boy, he's skinny, he plays on the soccer team. Nobody ever even notices him. Suddenly, his senior year of high school, he really fills out. He looks like a man, and all of these girls are suddenly noticing him for the first time in their life. He is being contacted by girls constantly. He can do nothing wrong, and everything he says is funny. That little boy who was starving to be noticed, who was dying on the inside, has now become the center of attention. He had his first sexual encounter when he was in college, and he was hooked. Now, it wasn't the sex that drove him. It was the rush of falling in love, of being loved, of being showered with affection. Every time he would get close to one of these girls, however, they would start trying to pry into his business, or they would smother him. So he started pushing them away. He can't handle this type of affection, so he leaves them. And he always blames them, never realizing that the common denominator of all of his failed relationships is him. He is afraid of intimacy. Fear has become his master, and fear is a horrible master. Okay, a young man falls in love with a beautiful lady, and after a few weeks of it wearing off in this relationship, she begins to make her signature move using emotional blackmail. It starts off with a demand. She approaches him one night and says, "We're doing so well, why don't I just move in with you? I mean, heck, I'll pretty much stay here all the time anyways." Well, he's not real cool with that, so he kind of pushes back a little bit. He's resisting this idea. She senses this resistance, so she redoubles her effort. She increases the pressure by saying something like, "I only want what's best for us," and then she does her signature move. She forces him to show his cards by saying, "Don't you love me? You do love me, don't you?" If he doesn't give in to her pressure, she will redouble her efforts. She will threaten to withhold her affection if he doesn't comply with her way of thinking. She may say something like this: "If you're not serious about us, maybe we're just not meant to be." Now, feeling pressured to cave in or risk losing the relationship, he complies with her emotional extortion. Unless he builds the courage to protect his boundaries, or unless she recognizes her sickness and begins to do something about it, the two of them will continue to live together, and he will grow to resent her. They will live in a sick relationship, never knowing real intimacy, never knowing true partnership. Instead, they live together as emotional hostages. A victim of physical abuse on the outside, she appears to have it all together. But on the inside, she's struggling. She cannot seem to make connections with people. She has her career, she has her degree. On the outside, everything looks good, but she has this inability to trust. Trauma from years of abuse has left her with this chasm of the inability to connect with people. At times, she feels an overwhelming sense of helplessness. She feels like she can't do things on her own. Now, her emotions begin to shut her down, and the best way to describe the pain or the feeling, the pressure that's inside of her is like it's numb. Or maybe her emotions are like strings or wires that get all tangled up and knotted together, and you can't sort out what's what, kind of like me when I go fishing with my fishing line. It's like a train wreck scattered everywhere. You can't sort what's what. Certain events trigger certain feelings of impending doom. Maybe it's the smell of the aftershave that he wears that somebody else is wearing, or maybe someone uses a peculiar phrase that he used to use. So when it kicks in, all of a sudden hypervigilance takes over. She overreacts, and then she's embarrassed because she can't explain to people why she's overreacting, because they don't understand. They don't get what trauma does to people's lives. Part of the trauma of PTSD is the inability to find the words to articulate how you're feeling. So there she is, all alone, with no one to walk through life with her, no one that she can explain things to. She's by herself because post-traumatic stress disorder has put her there. PTSD binds your soul. Viktor Frankl, he was a Jewish man in the 1940s. He and his family were sent off to Auschwitz by train. When they got there, they separated them. He survived daily abuse and inhumane working conditions at the hands of his captors, the Nazis. He was slave labor to them. The only way that he could survive was to go and do work for them every day and help them put the mechanisms in place that were designed to destroy his ethnic group, exterminate his race every day. Frankl survived the war. And after the war, after his liberation, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. This is what he said about the abuse that he suffered while he was in bondage. Beatings occurred on the slightest provocation, sometimes for no reason at all. I did not know what was going on in the line behind me, nor in the mind of the SS guard, but suddenly I received 2 sharp blows on my head. At such a moment, it's not the physical pain which hurts the most, and this applies to adults as much as children. It is the mental agony caused by the injustice, the unreasonableness of it all. Bondage is not limited to these. Paralysis, schizophrenia, manic depression, cerebral palsy, Tourette's, diabetes, and the list goes on and on. There's all kinds of ways that we have physical manifestations of bondage in our life. Bondage is expressed in a myriad of cruel ways. Bondage is one of the ways that sin and death has conspired to frustrate God's objectives for your life. Everywhere you look, people are in bondage in some way. It reminds me of a story we find in the book of Exodus, a story of where God calls upon a man to lead a nation out of bondage and into a land of promise. Now, just a quick rehash of the events. Israel is the house of Jacob. Joseph was one of Jacob's sons. Joseph's brothers were jealous of Joseph because of the coat of many colors his father made for him or gave to him. So they kidnapped him, they sold him into slavery, and they told the father, Jacob, that he had been killed. Once Joseph left his father's homeland and he was being traded off, he remained faithful to God despite what he had to face, and God raised him up to be a ruler over a part of Egypt. Later, a great famine came in his father's homeland. His brothers left their homeland. They went to a region of Egypt in search of mercy, in search of relief, because the famine had left them without food. They went and begged to their brother Joseph, not knowing that it was him. And Joseph, rather than exacting justice or revenge, allowed them to come and live. And he took care of them. He extended mercy. He extended grace, even though they didn't deserve it. But that is how the house of Jacob, which is Israel, wound up in Egypt. As we find out later on, they became slaves. It says, after Joseph died, his father's descendants were left in Egypt. They became the political target of the new Egyptian king. It says in Exodus 1, verses 8 through 11, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. As you can read here, the new administration had bad intentions towards Jacob's descendants, the people of Israel. Generations passed, and the burden of slavery upon their backs became heavier and heavier. They cried to God. God heard their cries and remembered the covenant that he made with their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let's read Exodus 2, verses 23 through 25. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Now notice the word remember there. It says God remembered the covenant. Now, I was talking with Barbara McGee earlier this week about this particular passage, and she shared with me something from one of Mike Wilkerson's books, which I thought was incredibly relevant. First of all, there's two ways to look at the word remembered. You could think and it's synonymous with recall, but there's a second meaning that is an implication of action. And it fits very nicely with something Dr. Foster taught us years ago about remembering. Members are pieces, like our appendages, our limbs are members of our body. If you have a jigsaw puzzle, each piece is a member of the entire image. When we remember, we are taking action to bring these pieces of the puzzle back together so that we can remember the image of the puzzle. God remembered his covenant. He went into action. He pieced together what had been fractured or what had been shattered. So God prepared a plan, and he asked an unlikely man to lead them. Let's read Exodus 3, verses 4 through 10. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good land and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the termites, and the satellites. Okay, I'm out of that. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. God confronted Moses as a burning bush. He told Moses that he was going to use him, the stutterer, to be the spokesperson for this nation. He was going to use him, the man who had murdered an Egyptian, to go in front of the Egyptian king, the Pharaoh, and tell him, let my people free. Let them go. Well, if you read the story, it didn't go over very well. Yeah, Pharaoh kind of put a little extra labor on their backs. God sort of retaliated and sent them some plagues. It's kind of a tense time for everybody involved. The final plague was the death of the firstborn of anyone who did not mark the doorpost of their house with blood as God had instructed. So many people died from this that the Egyptians were begging Israel to leave. When they didn't just jump and go, they celebrated a few festivals, which I'm sure went over really well. And then God sent a pillar of cloud to guide them by day and a pillar of fire to lead them by night. God's guiding cloud, God's guiding pillar began leading them towards the Red Sea. They got to the sea and there was no bridge. There was no way to get across. And in the background, trailing behind them, you could see the dust still being kicked up as Pharaoh's army, his chariots, his horses, his infantry, all these people with spears and swords that had come were moving in on them. And they were terrified. All they could see was drowning by death or drowning at the hands of Pharaoh's army. They saw no way out. This is a very important element in apocalyptic thought. When there seems no way out, God makes a way. God heard their cries, and this is what he told Moses to do. Exodus 14, 21 through 23. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind. Remember that word, wind, all night. And turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. So Moses and Israel crossed the Red Sea and it's like, woohoo, we made it. And they turn around and Pharaoh's army is taking the exact same path to come get them. And you know they were terrified. The very path that God made as an escape route for them became the path that led their murderers, their captors, to Israel. They sensed that their fate was imminent, that maybe God had made a mistake. They stood by helplessly as Pharaoh's army moved closer and closer. Let's read what happens. Exodus 14, 26 through 28. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. Oops. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. As I read and reread that passage, I was struck, I was dumbfounded, which is not hard to do, by the apocalyptic images of this event. Now, when I talk about apocalyptic images, I'm not talking about what you hear on the History Channel about the destruction of the world and all that stuff. I'm talking about the apocalyptic genre of Jewish theology. They had their own literature, their own apocalyptic literature. And in this literature, over and over again, it is a story of how God's children find themselves in these places that they cannot get out of. They find themselves in impossible situations that not the best amount of human reasoning or logic can get them through it. They're stuck. There's no way out. And somehow, God finds a way. Somehow he rescues them from the tidal waves of despair. Now listen very closely to this. Water symbolizes death. Remember the wind I asked you to take note of? I hope so. It wasn't that long ago. If you don't remember, you might see your doctor about it. Okay. Wind symbolizes the breath, the life, the spirit of God. In this moment, the wind, the breath, the spirit, the life of God pushes back death to get his people out of bondage. It's good news to me. Okay. What does God say about removing his people from bondage? From bondage? He says he will push back the tides of death, despair, and destruction to make a way for you where no human reasoning, no logic can find a way. I say, yay. I'm not here to judge what kind of bondage you have or how you got into bondage. But what I'm here to tell you is that if you find yourself in bondage, God hears your despair. He hears your cries. He sees your failed attempts over and over again to set yourself free. In his timing, whether it's on this side of death or on the other side of death, he has come to set you free. Okay, it's good news to me. Sometimes the path to freedom has names like AA or counselor or Financial Peace University. But make no mistake, people, God wants his children free. And these programs don't work the same way without a loving God going ahead of you, making the impossible possible. Moses pushed back the water. He pushed back death, but Jesus stood on death. Jesus walked on the water. And as he stood on the water and he beckoned Peter to come out of the boat, Peter was able to step out of the boat, and he didn't have to obey death either, because Jesus invited him to walk on the water, and he is inviting us to walk on death too. The one who came to give his life to those people from whom life has been robbed is not dead. Where two or more are gathered together in his name, there he is in the midst of them. Jesus is here. He is with us. He is among us right now. I saw him out in the lobby. He was turning the water into Starbucks with holy grounds. Jesus is here. He is alive. No, really, he is among us here today. He hears the funny things that you whisper to your neighbor that you don't think anybody else can hear. He thinks it's funny that your neighbor and you are fighting over who gets to use the armrest. He is alive. He is bringing life. He is bringing joy. He's playful. Now, one of the biggest obstacles that we've encountered over the years with embracing this type of faith is we start trying to calculate what God should or should not do. We find issues with the fact that God is not living up to our expectations. We turn the tables on him, for crying out loud. Who's God and who is creation? If I hear one thing that comes from the Gospels over and over again, it's the call to not judge God. He came here and he did not exempt himself from having to suffer the same things that we suffered. In fact, he went a little further when he gave up his life for all of us. The Gospel's call is not to judge him, but to trust him, to follow him. And God has revealed to us through this Exodus event and through the life of Jesus that if we follow him, he will lead us to this place he has for us. He hears our pain, he sees our dilemma, and he is making a way to get us out of bondage for any of us who are willing to claim it, who want to be set free. When Jesus was here on earth, he went around to a lot of people and he performed a lot of miracles. He would go to them, he would reach from within of himself, and he would give the life that he had, to give life to the people that life was robbed from, for the people who were sick, the people who had disabilities of some sort. He would impart life, and the people who had been judged and outcast, he would give them a pardon. He would give them a chance to be set free again. As far as I know, all of these people that Jesus performed miracles on are dead. Now, if you know of any people that are still alive, I would ask you to please come back and tell me about that after service. I'd like to meet one. But the point is that after the miracles happened, they died. Their hope did not rest in the idea that Jesus would make them immortal on this side of death. He was often reluctant to perform miracles for people because he didn't want to turn it into a carnival act. He didn't want to, be the famous thing that people would sell tickets to. He wanted to impart life, but he more than anything did it because he wanted people to believe that he was from the Father and that the love that he spoke of that came from the Father was real. Our hope doesn't lie our hope does not lie in the miracles that happen on this side of death. Our hope is in the promise of eternal life. And this is exemplified, it's demonstrated through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. His credibility was established because the Father glorified the life of the crucified Christ. And having been so glorified, he resurrected him. He did not resuscitate him. He was resurrected. God did not put old life back into a broken body. He breathed new life into that broken body. Upon his resurrection, Jesus still had the scars from his execution. He still had the wounds in his hands. He was so different that his disciples didn't even recognize him at first. Jesus was set free from the physical bondage of death. After death had had its way with his body, after death had danced on his grave, our Father in heaven raised him up. After death has killed you, after the bondage of sin has taken your last breath, after the wake of sin and death has had its jollies with your poor, tired soul, God will breathe a new life into you, a life that cannot be taken away, a life that is at one with him and with all of his creation. After death, death has no dominion over you. Listen to these words from 2 Corinthians 15:54 through 57. When this perishable body puts on imperishability and this mortal body puts on immortality, then the saying that is written will be fulfilled. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Amen. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Sin and death may have had their way with us today, but God will raise us up. He will set us free from the baggage and heavy loads that wear us down, free from the bondage that wants to take away our will to live. Death may have had its way today, but there will come a day when the weight of addiction will be lifted off your back, when the bondage of broken bodies will be set free to live and run like a wild stallion runs on the western plains. There will come a day when the restraints of disease that put us in wheelchairs, walkers, and leave us bedridden for years will no longer have its way. There will come a day when all will see, when all will hear, when all will be free to run into the arms of a loving God waiting to embrace you like you are his child. We will be free. The chains of schizophrenia and mental illness that tells us lies will be lifted right out of our minds, setting you free to connect, to dream big, bold, audacious dreams. There will come a day when the burdens of debt, self-hatred, toxic shame, fear, and anger will have no more dominion over you. There will come a day when you will be free to run to the mountains. There will be a day when your dreams will soar like an eagle, taking you wherever your heart so desires. When God made mankind, he assembled the dust of the earth, and then he breathed life into his lungs. After death has had its way here on earth, there will come a day when Jesus surveys the wake of carnage and death left behind by sin and evil, and he will bring about a new life, a life that is unaffected by death. Hebrews 9:27 and 28 says, and just as it is appointed for mortals to die once, and after that the judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. As Christ takes those of us who are eagerly awaiting him, death will no more have dominion in your life. And in the same way that God breathed life into the dust that he created, that he formed into man, a day is coming when Jesus will pan the wreckage that death and sin has done in this world, when he sees the carnage of dead bodies, when he sees the corpses laying there, and in one fell swoop, he will blow new life into you. Remember when you were a kid and your mom or dad would wake you up, like if you fell asleep in the car, or there was like a surprise you were going to, and they would just kind of nudge you and say, it's time to get up? There will come a day after we die. Papa God will stand over us as we slumber in our death, as we sleep in our death, and he will nudge us and say, it's time to get up. We're here. And when we wake up, we will wake up to a world that is not broken. A world is full of life as dolphins turning flips in the oceans or kids playing around on the monkey bars in the playground. A world where the bondage of sin and death will no longer have its way. It will no longer even be remembered. All of this because God cared enough about you and your bondage to leave where he was to come here. He didn't exempt himself from the pain that we go through. He embraced it. And in his sacrifice, God glorified his life and made a way. Jesus is that gate. Enter through that gate. As the death of this broken world threatens us day after day, as we face uncertainties in our life every day, while we carry loads of grief and shame and fear, there will come a day when death can no longer dance on your grave. When all of God's kids strapped down with disease, with bondage, with pain and suffering will be restored, will be resurrected. That day is coming, my friends, when we will be free. Let's pray. Our Father, thank you so much for doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves, for not being mean, for not giving us justice, for not looking past us even though we did some things we weren't supposed to, for loving us enough to go out and find us in the dark, dirty streets like Hosea did with Gomer to tell us that we're invited to come home, to give up yourself as a sacrifice to bring us all together, to be at one, to have a hope that all the sufferings of this present age will be nothing compared to the glory that you will reveal in us. Thank you for this promise. Thank you for this hope. And I pray, Father, that you would give us the courage to believe today that we are free and to go out into this world and love as a free person, as a free people ought to be, and to bring a few others along with us. We ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen.